ladies and gentlemen. Testing, testing, testing. Ladies and gentlemen, all right. Let's sit down and study for a few minutes, ladies and gentlemen. If you would join me, I promise I will release you to schmooze and eat and drink and whatever it is that you wish, because that's still yet to come. You know, the fun here does not end early. If you haven't figured this out, some people visit Tikvat David and they think, okay, the service is over, the fun is over. I'm like, no, this is it has not just yet begun. So the fun is not over. If you want to sit down for a few minutes, let's have a little discussion. I'm going to throw some verses as I usually do. We've been studying now the book of Romans, Shaul's writings, for 12 weeks. Can you believe this? I haven't done anything like that long for 12 weeks. 12 weeks in a row of Shaul. You know, hopefully you're not getting tired of it. Hopefully you're enjoying it. You know, I go through it pretty thoroughly with you, and the questions that you guys ask, the comments that you make are really valuable. So let's continue thinking together through Romans and discussing it. It's a foundational book. It's very important, I think. I think for the entire Christian world is very, very foundational. So that means we should know it, we should understand it, because a lot of times people ask us questions that come directly out of the book. So having a big picture, bird's eye view of this book is really important. So I entitled it Unity and Diversity because a lot of what's happening in the book of Romans people don't realize is kind of this disagreement that Shaul is trying to settle. And the way he settles it is by presenting what the good news is. And that good news message is supposed to unite us, all of us, Jews, non-Jews, Greeks, barbarians, wherever we may be. We can be united on that platform. So just a quick reminder of where we have been and where we're going. In chapter 7, which we studied last, Shaul explained to us how spiritual freedom from sin actually comes to us. Now in chapter 8, Shaul paints a contrast between living the life of the Spirit and living the life of the flesh. So this is yet another explanation of something he already has said. So it may seem redundant, but we're going to go through it anyway. Why? Because it's there. And of course, the question that we all must ask, why does he belabor this point? Why does he have to explain this yet one more time? And the answer is because his purpose has not changed. You see, book does not change the purpose. He has this message that he consistently tries to present to his audience. He still wants to inspire holy living. That's what he wants to do in his audience. He wants to call people to holiness. I don't know if you realize this or not, but he actually said it a few times, actually. And he's going to continue saying it in case people don't understand that is one of his very clear purposes. So in this particular section that we're going into right now, which is chapter 8, the term flesh comes up. And we talked about this term flesh, sarx in Greek, or basar in Hebrew. Basar actually literally means meat. That's the literal translation. So flesh is kind of a nicer English way of saying it. But we understand what it's talking about. It's our physical being. It's our human body, idiomatically. That's what it means. That flesh, this basar, represents the weakness of human existence. Namely, the weakness of our flesh, the weakness of our human being is sin. That's one part that we keep struggling with. So another term that Shaul presents to us in this particular chapter is the term spirit. And the term is pneuma in Greek or ruach in Hebrew. You're familiar with these terms, I trust. Mm-hmm. Pneuma, you know, like people have, I have a pneumonia or something like that. You hear that word? Yeah. You actually know a lot more Greek than you realize you do. Because Western society, it has to do with breath. It has to do with breathing. And guess what? That's what spirit means, by the way. Spirit, wind, breath. These are all terms. Ruach means all of that. So when we read Genesis and it says, and the Spirit of God hovered over the water, some translations translate that the wind of God, you know, did that. And so, or the breath of God. And that's a perfectly legitimate way of translating it because that's what the word means. So, spirit, pneuma, ruach, is again an idiom, just like the flesh. You know, he's not talking about breath. That part represents the inner part of human beings that seeks to do good and to emulate their maker. And what that goes back to is it goes back to Eden. It goes back to the creation of mankind. So when mankind were created, it says that God breathed into Adam life. He breathed into him. So that God's breath, his spirit, actually entered into Adam, and that's what made Adam alive rather than dead. He had flesh. He had body. He had this shell, but that shell needed to be filled and made alive. And it is the spirit, it's the ruach that made him alive. So here, Shaul does something. He idiomatically represents the human being as made up of flesh and spirit. The part that is visible, the meat, the bones, the physical body, and the part that is invisible, the spirit. That which makes us alive. That which makes actually us, us. Because I hope you realize that your unique personality, however quirky and unusual you may be, does not come from your DNA and your bones and blood, because all of that is, by the way, interchangeable. You know, you heard people donating parts and things like that. Somebody gives each other a kidney or donate blood and things like that. These parts are interchangeable, but what makes us us is that inner part of us. It is completely unique. Our character, our very being. People call this soul. There are many different ways in which we try to express this. So in this particular part, in this particular chapter, in this discussion, Shaul uses the term spirit. And by that term spirit, he means that part of human being that is spiritual. And it's what makes us as humans want to be like God. Why? Because that part of us comes from God. So we want to be the way we were made to be. But we struggle because that flesh is fighting against it. So that struggle he's already described, and that's what chapter 8 is going to be talking about. These terms are going to be popping up all over the place. So let's jump into reading and see if we can make sense of what Rabbi Shaul is writing to the city of Rome. So let's see, I'm picking up in verse 5 there. It says, "For those who are in accord with the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who are in accord with the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." So far, so good. Makes sense. Just logical. "For the mindset of the flesh is death, but the mindset of the Spirit is life and peace." So again, he's trying to tell you what the propensity, mindset, of course, he's also using idiomatic language here. He says, because the mindset of the flesh is hostile towards God. For it does not subject itself to the law of God, which clearly is Torah. We know how we've been talking about how the word law comes up many times in Shaul's writings in this particular composition, and how it means different things. But here he says law of God, so we know that's Torah. So it says that the mindset of the flesh is hostile towards God. It does not subject itself to Torah. The flesh, the body, the physical being does not want to be in subjection to the rules, to Torah, to these teachings, to these directions, to the instructions. Then he says, for it is not even able to do so. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Now that's a little bit of taking you a little further. Think about it. He says, those who are in the Spirit and those who are in the flesh. This entire chapter, Shaul is going to set this contrast. Okay? People who live in the Spirit and people who live in the flesh. Meaning people who allow the flesh to lead them and guide them, or people who allow the Spirit, that inner part that wants to be pleasing to God, allow that part to lead them. And we've talked about that struggle. I mean, we all recognize these things do exist in our life. It's very real. So Shaul here tells us, besides the fact that there's this idea of life and death and peace and struggle, and in the end, something revolutionary, he says, that a person who's living, who's the mindset of the flesh is hostile towards God, it's hostile towards Torah, and a person who's oriented this way is not even able to live in accordance with the Torah. Just tries and fails, basically. And those who are in the flesh, they can't please God. Why? Because the way to please God would be to conform to the things that God has told us we should conform to. But there's that inability. Yes, Jessica?
Oh, I wanted to share a really meaningful thought that I encountered about this dichotomy between the flesh and the spirit, because it's not even necessarily like a hostility to wanting to do good things, but even the very basics of how our bodies function. So Viktor Frankl, when he was in the camps, he described his experience. One of the biggest griefs that he had and sense of loss was being able to think about anything else besides food and warmth. He said he just longed for his mind to not be preoccupied with those things, and that has only to do with the basic functions of the body, right? And so when you're in survival mode, even that plays into this, that it's not necessarily that we're against God out of this, like, we hate God. It's just very simply your body does what it needs to survive, and sometimes that's like in the camps, and sometimes that's like just going to your shift and cashing your paycheck and going grocery shopping and cooking your food, and even that can make it difficult, to ascend and reach out.
It's a struggle, essentially, to orient ourselves towards that spiritual side of us. And because, honestly, let's be honest, it's a lot easier to not orient ourselves towards the spiritual side of us, right? It's a lot easier just kind of hide that, shove it, put it away, deny it. It's not real. It's not happening. What's real is, I need to eat this right now. Well, whatever it is that, the flesh or our human existence, just our life, our being, is very much a part of who we are. And so there's that struggle. Thank you, Jessica. That's a great way of describing it. That it's a good illustration for these ideas. So it might seem radical to us when we read that, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But what he's trying really to say is that if we do want to please God, then we should try orient ourselves towards a much more spiritual direction. Yes, Dave? No? Okay, you just raised your hand again. So you're stretching. Okay, good. So this is what happens. You stretch, I call it. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Where would Paul place himself when he looks back to where he was a zealous Jew without the Lord?
Right.
He was a student of Gamaliel.
He told you how he feels. He says he struggles with this himself. He actually used himself as an example right there in the previous chapter. So we know that as a human being, he struggled just like everybody else has struggled. And so with his zeal, by the way, that has to do with his character. And our character is our inner part. That's not biological, if you want to think about it. What made Shaul a man zealous after God is the spiritual part of him. It made him yearn and want that which is not right. Why do we get upset when there's injustice? Because that part of us that's on the inside wants to make things right. Because it comes from God, so it knows what should be right. So when we see wrong, it really disturbs us. And even if we may not be in power to change anything, we still feel upset. We feel pain of other people, we see the suffering of other people, and it really, really turns us inside out sometimes. Why? That's us being spiritual. That's us feeling that, which is real. It's quite real. Because biologically, we shouldn't be feeling it. See what I'm saying? Biologically, it's what happens to another person shouldn't bother me, right? Because we're not connected. Maybe family member, fine. You could say, you have an affinity for these people, but people across the world, I don't know them. Why am I connected to them? Because it's a spiritual connection. See, that's us being the spirit beings that we are. I don't remember who said this. I think C.S. Lewis actually said that. He said a very interesting phrase. He said, people think of humans of a body that has a spirit. He said, actually, humans are spirits that just happen to have a body.
Yes.
When I read that, I'm like, wow, that's a great way, a very inspiring way to look at it. because we're used to thinking of it in exactly the opposite way. We think of a spirit being secondary, but actually we're spirits that happen to have a body.
I was listening to a rabbi this week talk about this. He's talking about death and life and how many people consider life temporary and death permanent, but it's really the other way around. Life is eternal and death is temporary. Death is never meant to be a part of it.
Right.
But he said when God created our bodies, see, the body was nothing until the spirit came into it and it acted upon the body. He says everything while we're moving, everything we do, our spirit, our nebesh, our neshama is acting out life, just using our body. We see because it is our souls are seeing through our eyes. And if we go out of our body, then we see more because we're not limited to the eyes at that point. It was very interesting.
That's nice. It's another beautiful perspective of thinking about it. Just an example, you get in the car, right? You turn the lights on. You get the ignition and you start driving. Are you the car? No, you're the driver. The car simply is a mechanism that moves you down the road, and those lights that hit the road doesn't hurt your eyes, right? It allows you to see and things like that. But it's a unique way to consider ourselves and what role we actually play and which part of us should be the driver. Jeremy, right there back.
The C.S. Lewis reference is an excellent one, and I think in another one of it, he has a whole book dedicated to this. He fictionalizes it, but the idea that we have this idea that the spirit realm is this sort of this amorphous thing, right? And there's so many caricatures of that, and he plays with that. And I think it's firmly based in the Torah and in the entire scriptures. Is that actually the spirit world is the solid world? This is the amorphous world. And anybody who, I'm not a physicist, but from what I understand from physics, you start getting into quantum physics, and you realize our entire experience here, matter itself is mostly empty space. It's held together by these strange things called electrons and all these forces, and this is the amorphous world. That's the solid world.
Yeah, it's very real, and it's real to Shaul. And it should be real to us. We should be able to identify with the words as we read them. So let's keep moving. Let's see if what next we run into. Romans chapter 8, 9 through 11. However, you are not the flesh. You're not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. If indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, he does not belong to him. If Messiah is in you, through the body, though the body is dead because of sin, yet the spirit is alive because of righteousness. But if the spirit of him who raised Yeshua from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Messiah Yeshua from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who dwells in you. Actually quite logical, right? This kind of leads you step by step. Now, what I want you to realize, you are reading it with your eyes of educated people who have been studying these things from time to time, and you've been exploring the scriptures, and you've been thinking spiritual thoughts. How do you think a Roman citizen would take it? Somebody who comes from paganism, somebody who worships these strange gods like Zeus and Athena, and believes in Hercules and This is going to take them on the trip. Mm-hmm. This is be like outer space stuff. Like, you may find comfort in this and say, oh yeah, sure, it makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. But just for a second, put yourself in a mindset of an average Roman in that day. Remember, Christianity does not exist. None of them have actually been exposed to any of this Jewish stuff. This is just the beginning. And now Shaul is writing this letter to them. But this has got to be really hard for them to understand. But they're grappling with this idea. That's why he's being repetitive. That's why he's being logical. That's why he writes it rather than just says it. And he sends it to them so they can read it, reread it, and think it through and realize it. And he actually tries to speak their language in many ways. But it is a very Jewish language. So he says, you are not in the flesh. You are in the spirit. So he's calling them out. He says, look, you are different. if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. But we realize that if you're alive and you're breathing and you're moving, then fundamentally it's the God who gave you that breath. And then he says, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, then that's different. Now, you can have the Spirit of God, you can walk around, but do you have the Spirit of Messiah? And that's something a little bit different that Shaul here brings into this conversation. He says he does not belong to him. Because believing in Messiah, having Messiah as your Messiah, having him as, sort of say, your connection to something that God has done is a whole different aspect beyond the fact of just being alive. So if you have Messiah, if you believe in Messiah, and you've united yourself with Messiah in the way that he described before, he talked about being buried with him. He talked about rising with him. He talked about being dipped and immersed into Messiah and his sufferings and then coming back to life. If this is something that happened to you spiritually on the inside, if you lived through that metamorphosis, then he calls that being a Messiah, or Messiah being in you, essentially. And that's that idea of the Spirit of Messiah. So if Messiah is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, yet the Spirit is alive because of righteousness. Whose righteousness? His righteousness. Exactly. Because the Spirit of Messiah is what sanctifies us, essentially, from the inside out. It is him and his merit of giving us the righteousness that we lack, because we keep struggling the same exact battle and not winning it. So he comes in and he gives us that, his merit, as a tzaddik, as a righteous one, as the one who has no sin, who is able to bear ours. He comes in and says, tap into this, what I have, my righteousness. So he says that your body may be dead, but the Spirit will be alive. But then that's not the end of it. If God did raise Yeshua from the dead, and he did raise his body from the dead, not just his spirit from the dead, then your body can also be resurrected and sanctified and be essentially remade without that component of sin, which is making us weak, essentially. And that is the future. That is the eschatological hope that we read about in the prophets. The end-time hope is that one day all of Israel and actually the entire world will walk with God and know God, and they will live in obedience to God. We haven't seen that yet, but that is the vision of the prophets, that we will all know God and walk with him righteously and not be tempted the way we're tempted right now. Why? Because the sin is no more. Hopefully you read books like Revelation, and it talks about sin be no more. The prophets talk about it. There are no tears. There are no death. There is no suffering. There's no more sin. There's no hunger. There's no thirst. These things are gone. Now, that glorious future is hard to imagine. Why? Because the prophets give us but the glimpses of that, but that is what we're talking about. So if that is a hope of ancient Jews, that one day all of that struggle that we have is eradicated completely. And it's not just Israel, it's actually the whole world, because God will remake and recreate everything anew. That's Shaul trying to explain to us a really big picture. Like I said, it's a tough one for some people to embrace. So as before, Shaul's goal is to orient people to live holy lives. I want to stress that. His hope is that they would subject themselves to God's ways and that they would resist sinful living. So he taught this through the metaphor of dying with Messiah. He taught this through the metaphor of rising with him, being immersed in Messiah's death. And so he's used a number of different visions that he has painted for us, little pictures that he painted for us, these metaphorical ideas of how our relationship is with God. And now, this latest analogy is life in the spirit versus life in the flesh. I hope you realize that this is the same old thing that he's describing to us, yet in another way. And the battle is inside of us. It can be won. And obedience is actually possible. The goal is victory over weakness of the flesh that entices one to sin. That's what Shaul is writing about. That's what he hopes that his audience will understand. And that is a message that universally applicable both to Jews and non-Jews, because all you have to do is be human to recognize that that's really what's happening with all of us. So that brings some unity to us. let's continue. Romans 8, 12 through 13. So then, brothers and sisters, see how he addresses them like a family. That's a nice endearing way. It says, we are under obligation not to the flesh, to live according to flesh. For if you are living in accord with the flesh, you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you're putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. So he says we're not under obligation to the flesh. Meaning the flesh wants what the flesh wants. Our bodies want what they want. But we're not obligated to oblige that. If we're going to continue to live according to the flesh, we'll die. And that's what happens. These bodies, they fall apart. But if you're living according to the Spirit, then what he says is very interesting. He says you're putting to death the deeds of the body. That's when you will live. So to live by the Spirit, one can say that it means to kill the deeds of the body or the flesh, meaning to deny your sinful desires. It's not something new. Yeah.
So I like how the English is rendered here in verse 13, putting to death the deeds of the body, because, and you may be able to confirm this from Greek, it implies a present tense ongoing activity. Right, so other English translations don't do that. They say, put to death, as if it's something that you can do and then have done.
Right.
But I think this rendering better expresses the fact that you're never done.
Yeah. So I'm using NASB here to read with you. If you guys haven't figured this out, NASB is kind of like my favorite translation in English. It's not perfect. It's far from being perfect. I found so many different weird things in it. But as any translation, it's just going to have defects. Translators are people. Most of the time, it renders the text in a very literal kind of way. And I like that because it actually preserves the Greek grammar. And the Greek grammar is what it is. And it accurately depicts this. So something that David said that's really important. Putting to death the deeds of the body. It's not something that you just do and it's done. It's actually done over and over continually. It's something that goes on. It's like you are denying yourself, not once, and then it's done. You're actually fighting that battle of denying yourselves more than once, over and over and over. And it's something that, can be practiced and a person can live that way. Of course, it takes discipline, it takes perseverance, and that's where many of us just don't have it. And that's why we misstep. That's why we make mistakes. That's why we mess up. That's why even the best intentions, sometimes don't work out. So to deny your sinful desires and to continue to deny and continue to fight them is what Shaul is trying to orient his disciples towards. So if you haven't figured this out, there's a lot of language of spirit and flesh and a lot of language of life and death here. These are the metaphors that he keeps playing with. And it's actually quite purposeful. It is a very familiar choice, death and life. So Shaul's life in the spirit, or what we call spiritual life, is very similar to Moshe's life of obedience, which also, by the way, grants life. So how about this? Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15. See, I have set before you this day life and good, death and evil. You remember that chapter? Mm-hmm. So we read this in the Torah every year. And so it's very simple. The choices are what they are. And that's, of course, just the very beginning of it. There's a little bit more to that. But I want you to see that it's the same choice that Shaul is offering his disciples. This is not an entirely new idea. It's familiar to Jews. Deuteronomy chapter 30, the verse 16 continues, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his ordinance, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you this day that you shall perish, and you shall not live long in the land which you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. the context is a little bit different. They're talking about entering the land, right? And the challenges that they're going to see, the biggest challenge for Israel at that moment is idolatry, worshiping idols, which is why it's being set up that way. But Moshe speaks of this prosperous and long life in the land of promise. And Shaul, well, he speaks about successful spiritual life in general. So you have a specific example versus a more generic example in Shaul. But essentially, they are presenting the same set of values.
With the language that Paul uses to put Yeshua in the place of Adam, could this be contextualized as like God speaking to Cain to tell him to choose between life and death as well? And like even the idea of like the mindset on the flesh is death, that being maybe even a pun of like Cain thinking about Abel's sacrifice, his sacrifice of flesh on the altar, even that could be like the mindset, even that could be a pun, that this is a rehearsal and exposition and expansion of God's speech to Cain.
Yeah, so God's speech to Cain also was, I guess, many of us can read it and kind of take it to heart, because it's a human failure of, right there in the very beginning of human history, if you think about it that way. And it hits us hard, because here's two brothers, they have everything, and yet it goes so terribly wrong. And that is our story in many ways, and that is that struggle. So yeah, thank you, Dave, for bringing it up. These words are not new. The context is a little bit different, but the gist is the same. It's the same choice. It's a choice between life and death, right and wrong, and in the end, that's what we face. And Shaul, of course, wants us to choose life. He wants us to choose the right choice, but that means to live by the Spirit, and that means to deny your flesh. So the battle that Shaul described in his letter is really not new. It's the same choice. It's a life of the flesh, following your own path, that our sinful flesh entices us. It ends in death. That's what he says. Life of the Spirit, that life of resisting the urges of the flesh leads to a better life, and eventually to eternal life. And the difference is that now we have the Messiah's example, we have his merit. That obviously did not exist in the book of Deuteronomy. So some things have changed, but some things have not changed. Our internal struggle is the same. And Shaul is drawing on these types of themes and ideas. Now, as a Jew reading that passage in Romans, you're immediately drawn to Torah, to places like that, and where the Roman audience certainly would probably have their own places that their mind would go. Shaul, that's why he spends a lot of time explaining these things. For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons and daughters of God. Whoa. For you have not received the spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons and daughters, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. Spirit himself testifies within our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Messiah, if needed, we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. Now that is packed with a lot of interesting language here. Led by the Spirit. So if you are being led by the Spirit, that's what he means by living the life of the Spirit. He says if you are led by the Spirit, and of course this is God's Spirit that's leading you, then you can be called sons and daughters of God. That's pretty amazing. And then he talks about slavery and adoption and calling God Abba, which is just Hebrew, father, right? So we have a little translation there. He breaks into Hebrew and gives you translation. And then the Spirit himself, the Spirit, God's Spirit, which is alive, testifies with our spirit. So God's Spirit is in us, that we are children of God. So we have this testimony being presented to us. We have this witness. God's Spirit living within us witnesses that we are God's children. That's how we know we're God's children. And he says, if you're children, you're heirs also. Now, heir, of course, is someone who inherits things, right? Mm-hmm. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Messiah. So Messiah is an heir. He inherits things from God. But now you become, he says, fellow heirs with Messiah. If indeed we suffer with him. so that we may also be glorified with him. So if you walk this path, the path of Messiah, if you try to be like him, if you're being his follower, if you're part of his family, if you're part of his flock, if that's who you belong to, and you try to live your life this way, then you're part of his family, and you become an heir together with him. Now that is a very unusual idea. I mean, I don't know how many passages in the Bible develop this idea, but this idea of sonship and adoption and being heirs, I mean, Shaul gets into that in another book later. Actually, the book a letter that was written before that one is the letter of Galatians. He talks quite a bit in that context about it, but it's a little bit different. What I want you to notice is this. There's a language of slavery versus adoption. It's actually not dissimilar from Exodus, where Hashem calls Israel his firstborn son. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And the entire clan of Israel is called children of Israel, Bnei Israel. Essentially, they're God's adopted children. If Israel is the firstborn, then all of the Israelites are Bnei Israel. I heard once a really, really funny joke. Sunday school girl is asking a teacher, Miss so-and-so, can you tell me, we keep reading these verses about the children of Israel walking through the desert and doing this. Where were the adults? So that language can mislead us. When we say children of Israel, we think of little ones, right? But what it's really trying to say is descendants, B'nai. So Ben is the word for that familial relationship, that in a connection of a family relationship. That's what it's talking about. So when we're being called, when Israel is called firstborn son, or when the entire clan of Israel is called children of Israel, well, literally it means the descendants of Israel, who is Jacob, right? But in the big picture, it's the family of God. They're God's children, essentially.
As you said that, it made me think of the first generation that was over 20 years old that perished, and all the children.
Yeah, the children, who were not children, by the way, when they entered the land.
That's
like,
right.
We can't think of them as 5-year-olds.
I think it's interesting too that this is in the context of the letter to the Romans, right? And in Rome, the emperors, they didn't give the empire to just their biological kin, right? Like the whole first series of Roman emperors gave it to whoever they brought into their family, raised and felt like emulated the politics and the characteristics that they saw in themselves. So it was not biological. So there's also an understanding there, even apart from.
You could be adopted into a family, and in the Roman world that did happen. And of course, in the high families of Rome, right, the aristocrats, that has happened quite a bit. So somebody who may not be your physical biological heir, who could be actually your nephew, you take into your household and raise him and groom him to be your successor. He may not be your son or even grandson, he could be your nephew or something like that, and that happens. Or it could be an outsider. So I want you to realize that there's this language of slavery and redemption, and this is another aspect that kind of works into this. Just wrap your mind around this. Slaves, when they were redeemed from slavery, they were always joined to the family of the one who redeemed them. So being a part of God's family, having that special status that actually confirms inheritance rights upon you. Why? Because God redeemed you. You became a part of His family. That's where you belong. Why? Because He bought you. You're His, literally. So where else are you going to find your inheritance but in Him, to whom you now belong? So the language of this slavery and adoption and inheritance and being heirs, all of that is a very human language, but it also is a very spiritual language. Because the thought is this: whatever Messiah inherits, those who are His kin, they inherit it together with Him. It's that family connection, essentially. I don't know, a lot of times we don't think about that type of relationship when we think about Messiah, of being part of His family, actually. Being part of the clan and inheriting these things. So Messiah, by the way, stands to inherit some pretty amazing things. And that means those who are His will be co-heirs. They will be inheriting it alongside of him. And that's what you actually see in the prophets. That's what you'll see in Revelation. Things like that. Jeremy, I see your hand.
Speaking of Revelation, that's where I'm going.
Go.
So the answers are always in the back of the book, right? You know, in every text. So go to the very end of the last book, and what do you see? Descending from heaven, the New Jerusalem. I like to say it's not New Rome.
Right.
It's not New
Exactly.
York.
Not New Paris
It's not-
or New London.
Exactly.
Right.
It's New Jerusalem. And what is New Jerusalem? Well, it tells you that there are 12 gates, and
Yes.
each of the 12 gates is the 12 tribes of Israel. So all peoples, all kindreds, tongues, tribes, and nations will enter that city, but God had the vision from the beginning that the children of Israel that's the name of the bride.
Amen.
12 gates. You're right. Each one of those gates is named after one of the tribes. So the question is, which one are people going to be going through? Right? It's going to have to be one of them, because there's no other way of getting in.
Yes.
You can't just get smuggled into that city, which is cubicle, by the way. It's very interesting. Read Revelation. It's a fascinating book. Staying in Romans now. It's a beautiful language. Shaul is just getting us into some pretty amazing places, right? Slavery, adoption, being children of God, right? Inheritance. Why is he doing all that? Who do you think needs to hear this more than anybody else in that crowd? Remember, Shaul is speaking to Jews, Shaul is speaking to non-Jews. Who do you think needs to hear it more?
Gentiles with us. Genetic.
Jews already know they're God's children. They already have promises. They have an entire history of their entire civilization written out in Torah, and they know their origins. But this God took them out of Egypt, put them before Sinai, gave them Shabbat, gave them all the holidays, all the stuff. Imagine yourself being a Roman, and you're saying, how do I relate to all this stuff, by the way? And he's trying to help you. He's trying to help you see the answers. The way you relate to that is that you've been adopted into this family that has this amazing, rich, long history. And yes, you get to be co-heirs. You get to inherit some pretty amazing things. But all of that means living by the Spirit. That's what it takes. Because that's the kind of life that you're being called to. The life of the Spirit, not the life of the flesh. Because that's the goal. That was the goal set before Israel. That is the goal set before anybody who wants to be associated with Israel. Same thing. Life of the Spirit. Spiritual life. So Shaul gets pretty deep in these verses. That's what I want you to understand. He speaks about the sons, the daughters, and the part that I'm going to actually skip, I think maybe C.S. Lewis was inspired by that part. He talks about the sons and daughters of God being revealed to the creation, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this Narnia idea where the whole Narnia is waiting for whom? Right. No, they were actually waiting for the sons of Adam to come to get the whole process going, right? They're the part that cannot, they have to be there. So the entire creation yearns for the children of Adam to return. That's what some of these verses in Shaul say. It's not hard to imagine in this midst of all the spiritual language, the imagery that's shared and embraced by both Jews and non-Jews. It's meant to show them their joint destiny in the restoration of the entire world. Because when we're talking about sons of Adam, when we're talking about children of God, that is something that is much more uniting, right, than just clan language, family language. You're expanding that family back to Adam. That includes everyone. Shaul does this on purpose because he wants for the Roman audience to understand how they are personally connected to this message, to this good news that is originally for Israel, but not for Israel alone. It's also for the entire world. So that's what it's about. And so as we read, we remember that Shaul's goal is to bring about a sense of unity among all his disciples. And then these are the verses that I want to wrap this up with. These are beautiful. This is towards the end of the chapter. After he talks about the creation yearning to see the sons of Adam, he says, "What then shall we say to these things?" Nice hypothetical question. Guess what? He's a rabbi. He's going to answer it. If God is for us, who's against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? Who will separate us from the love of Messiah? Will tribulation, or trouble, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? None of those things will separate us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God that it is in Messiah Yeshua, our Lord.
Hallelujah.
Powerful, right? That he just wrapped it up. So this is why you have to read him sequentially, so that there's this build up, and then you have this. What shall we say to all this stuff that I have been talking about for the past 5 chapters? Boom. Nothing is going to separate us from the love of God. All these things that we really struggle with, right? And we're not strangers to these things. We fear danger, we fear tribulation and trouble and sword. That's not going to separate us from God. Not even death. Not angels, not principalities, not power. Nothing is going to separate us from God. And that love of God that we have, he says that love is found in Messiah, Yeshua, our Lord. Why? Very simple. We'll look a little bit more to the top. He says he did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all. He gave him up so that we may benefit. So if that's the kind of God we have, that this is the God of love, ultimate love is to give up that which you don't want to give up because you want someone that you love so much to benefit from that. Even if you don't want to give it up, it is dear to you. You give it up. Why? Because you care. Because you love. That is the ultimate act of love and sacrifice and selflessness. And that is what's happening in these verses. And Shaul says, this is how we can understand that spiritual dynamic.
This was the passage that the Tim Boone family was reading when the Nazis came to arrest them for hiding Jews and literally saving the lives of those that were still hidden that were never discovered. They had a weekly or regular Bible study, and they were literally reading this passage when the Gestapo pulled up to arrest them.
Those of you who don't know the story of Corrie ten Boom and her family, a remarkable woman who's gone through camps, and the whole family were arrested. They were hiding Jews, and they paid for it. They paid for it with their lives. You know, her sister, she survived, and she survived to tell her story, but many in her family did not. And so this is what would make a righteous Gentile essentially be a righteous Gentile. Because that kind of love that comes to you, and you're understanding that you're connected to this God of Israel, how can you allow for people to be destroyed like that? He says, this is Shaul. He says, to whom belongs the prophets and the promises and all the holy things in the temple. That's where it is. So it's a powerful passage. And many people dwell on these words. Why? Because they speak to the depth of our being. But that's the kind of God we serve. That is a beautiful way to present God to a Roman audience who doesn't know that kind of God necessarily.
And this is coming from a guy who persecuted the faith and was willing to bear false witness against Stephen, and yet he says this.
Right, so remember Shaul in his zeal, the first and early followers of Messiah. He persecuted them. Why? Because he thought they were Meshuggahs. They're crazies. They're insane. I mean, who believes in this kind of Messiah that this happens? Dangerous heretics. They should be set straight. So he looked for them, he found them, he brought them to Jerusalem to stand on trial so they could literally be physically punished, reprimanded, and maybe even jailed for the kinds of things that they would purport to spread in the community. So he saw that as a disease, and that's what he did. Shaul was a persecutor of the first followers of Yeshua. and later himself became a follower of Yeshua. So grace of God, persecuted follower of Yeshua. He became that which he persecuted, and there was plenty of others who continued in his steps, essentially. He talks about his persecutions all the time. So yes, he understands this very personal, this is very real to him. Thank you, Danny, for bringing it up. That's an excellent point. Excellent point. Thank you. Yes.
And his objection wasn't, out of nowhere. I mean, Israel wasn't gathered from the four corners of the earth. There wasn't peace on earth. There wasn't the kingdom, the restored fortunes of Israel. So it wasn't a baseless denial.
Yes. So it's not like he was doing it because he was just evil and a mean guy.
How can
He had good reasons.
This hasn't happened.
He had good reasons. Yeah, and we understand that about Shaul, and he talks about it himself. He talks about his journey. He talks about his transformation. So you can read in the book of Acts, that tells you what happens to Shaul on the road to Damascus, and his entire life comes into that. And yes, he becomes that person who starts writing things like that. It's pretty amazing. Yes?
There's an interesting irony, not just for this passage, but for the entire book of Romans, the audience to who it's addressed, and even tying in with Shaul, that it was actually the corrupt religious leadership that rejected the Messiah, the Messiah, the King, because of the loyalty to Rome. They actually said this.
Right.
They said, "We have no king but Caesar."
Yes. Those are
I'm-
the words
I'm-
of Caiaphas, yeah.
That is a corrupt leadership. Their loyalty was not to Jerusalem, not to the Torah. It was to Caesar.
Right. Yeah. People in power want to keep their power. And Caesar will keep things going as they are. And that's what usually people who are in power don't want to shake things up. That's understandable. I get it. So yeah, anyway, I can't think of a better passage to wrap things up on, but I want you to mill over it and think about how Shaul is trying to explain to his audience what this entire relationship with God is all about. If God is for us, who can be against us? What do we have to worry about? What do we have to fear? They have things to fear. Because guess what? All of these people are going to be persecuted, by the way. He's writing a letter to these people who are going to be a minority in Rome, and they're going to be persecuted. It's going to be many, many years until Romans officially recognize these kinds of ideas and adopt them and then completely change them and transform them into something else. Which is why I'm having to teach and explain the book of Romans to begin with. But that's a whole different part of the story. Now we're reading an ancient document, a document from 2,000 years ago. And we can, knowing a little bit of history, understanding the background, we get it. We understand how this is happening. So it's a really assuring message, I think, for all of us. So let's dwell on that, and then we will forge forward into chapter 9 and 10, 11 next. Okay, so that's something to look forward to.